Hello everyone, I'm Greg Weaver. Welcome to the Audio Analyst. Pardon me. I wish I could cite who I first heard say, we can hear many things we can measure, but we can't measure many of the things we can hear. It may have been my friend who co-founded Infinity with Ernie Nudell and who went on to found Spectron Audio, the late John Ulrich, when he was sharing a story with me about the preamplifier he built that measured almost flawlessly, but that no one who heard it liked. But to me, with nearly 5 decades in and around the high-performance audio industry, it is an undisputable truth. Now, YouTube is a remarkably diverse platform. If you take the time to search, you are likely going to find any number of channels, or at least an abundance of dedicated videos, focused on some aspect or variety of the world of audio equipment and music reproduction that really matters to you, whether that be SET amplification, DIY projects, budget gear, tube rolling, tweaking, or vintage electronics and loudspeakers. But if you're a flat earther, someone who believes all cables and amplifiers sound the same, that run-in is self-delusion, that digital audio simply must sound better than records because of some comparative numerical advantages, this is not your channel, okay? Please just click away from the site now and don't waste your time or mine viewing or trying to argue. You simply won't be engaged here. But for the rest of us, I want to explain why I've become a champion of and become so engaged with the absolute best available audio gear, or hyper audio. I've been involved in this industry since my teens, and for the past 20 years, I've been fascinated by and focused on that leading edge of our industry, that segment of products that bravely and relentlessly push the limits of materials technology to their application, apply bold new design approaches, and explore combinations of fresh thinking and technological implementation that drive us beyond current standards and established limits to set new benchmarks. I've also had a lot of pushback over these decades, but with both increasing frequency and intensity over the past 5 years or so, since I really started to focus on what has become known as the luxury audio segment of the market. Here I'm talking about gear that is priced into 6 or even approaching 7 figures. But this is where my interests lie. Discovering and experiencing these products that are at the bleeding edge of technology. Those that demonstrate the ability to radically diminish the distinction between playback and the live performance. This is the segment of our industry where pioneering engineers and visionary designers continue to routinely chip away at the gap between live and playback, almost daily, bringing us closer and closer still to accomplishing that grand deception of convincing us that we're listening to live music. The pushback I get is that such products represent a conspicuous and utter waste of money, that they afford no real sonic advantage over their more reasonably priced components. I had one reader go so far as to write me to help me understand that while there was no debate that his $6,000 system clearly sounds every bit as good as the sound I'm enjoying from my current reference rig, one with a value closing in on 7 figures. And he was, however, good enough to acknowledge that below about the $6,000 range, the very amount he has invested, that the quality gets really iffy. And this illustrates one of my points. It almost seems as if some of these flat earthers adopt an if I can't afford it, it can't sound better attitude. Now, clearly, I'm not suggesting that just because something is expensive, it will sound more like live music. Everything sounds different, most assuredly. But price alone is not a guarantor of sonic achievement. Now, while I have to admit to having heard some atrocious sounding cable looms that were selling well into the 6 figures, I can assure you that cables are components. My current reference speaker cables are the designs of Sergei Timochev, the man behind Stealth Audio, whom I first met at CES 2002. While it's embarrassing to admit, the 2.5-meter set of Dream V14 speaker cables I use sell for about as much as a new Honda Civic sedan. Can I justify that? Well, given what they allow to happen when connected between my AudioNet Max amplifiers to drive my Von Schweikert Audio Ultra 9s, there is no way I could choose to go back to something less expressive, less resolving, and less authentic. I had a good friend and fellow audio journalist spend several days visiting me last winter. On our second full day of auditioning and listening, about 4 hours into that session, he got a phone call and stepped out of my music room to take it. I took that opportunity during his 20-minute absence to replace the set of speaker cables that we had been listening to the entire time, and from another well-regarded manufacturer, selling for about half as much as the Stealths. Replaced them with my Stealth V14 Dreams. Now, when he returned from that call and took his listening seat again, in less than 30 seconds after resuming our listening session, with no change of volume, source, or anything else, he spun the chair to face me and asked, "Okay, what the hell changed while I was on the phone?" Sadly, I do understand some of the outrage over the prices charged by some cable manufacturers, especially given some of the extraordinary and mostly unsupportable marketing and advertising claims some companies make. But when you look at the engineering, technology, and materials that go into some of today's more reputable products, and factor in the cost of doing business, which every company, not just audio companies, must do, you may easily begin to understand the pricing of some of these more exotic products. As with any business, the pricing structure has to be able to support the company's sustainability, which, beside covering the obvious costs of raw materials, the construction process, often requiring painstaking and time-consuming attention to detail to actually fabricate these remarkable creations, quite often by hand. It also has to include things like payroll, taxes and fees, rent, utilities, the specialized machinery and equipment that they use, including the upkeep and replacement cycle for that equipment, as well as things like marketing, packaging, warehousing, shipping, warranty, dealer network support, and research and development. Now, I'm not suggesting that everyone should care to pursue this level of product, or more to the point, should be put out or bothered by its very existence. As I mentioned, I've had pushback from viewers and readers suggesting that such products really cannot sound any more realistic or offer any more sonic advantage over more affordable gear. But until you've spent time living around this stratum of equipment, it may be easy enough to choose to, or even to want to, believe that. But it just isn't so. You are only fooling yourself. It's as if these listeners are saying that because they can't or choose not to afford such items, they begrudgingly and dogmatically insist that such items can't be better than the products that they are currently listening to or own, as did my earlier critic referencing his $6,000 system. Now, this is not only an unnecessarily foolish and petty way to choose to react, it is flat out unsupportable. Let's look at a parallel comparison, okay? One of the most popular cars in America in 2019 was the Toyota Camry, with an average retail price of $25,000. It is plenty of car and more than merely satisfactory for most small families or single professionals. But compare that to a Bugatti Chiron, okay? With a sticker price just shy of $3 million. It's easily more than 100 times more expensive than the average automobile sold in the US today. The Bugatti Chiron boasts a quad turbocharged 8-liter 16-cylinder engine. It develops 1,500 horsepower and 1,180 pound-feet of torque. Now, We can debate all day long as to whether or not any passenger automobile is worth a cool $3 million. But I guarantee you, the Bugatti offers staggeringly better acceleration, cornering, braking, and a much more exhilarating experience getting you from point A to point B than any Toyota ever made. Okay? The same is true with hyper audio gear. Further, these flagship, uber performing, exotic, and expensive hyper products that are testing existing limits by employing rare, exotic materials and perhaps difficult or complex fabrication techniques, leveraging every technological advantage available, every advance in design and assembly known to man, even experimenting and developing new ones here. Such products typically necessitate manufacture in very small and limited quantities and are often made by hand. Now, as such, they simply cannot take advantage of the economies of scale that, when eventually able to be applied to manufacturing processes down the road with time, will contribute to lower prices, making these once absurdly costly products available to a wider audience. Folks, hyper audio gear is essentially part of the farm system that allows for higher and higher performance of audio gear at all price points. Look at the lessons learned from the monumentally expensive American space program in the 1960s and what it did for the electronics industry. Because the Soviets had beaten us to space with the launch of Sputnik in the fall of 1957, it suddenly raised doubts around the world about the perceived American technological and scientific superiority. Now, the first solid-state electronic calculator that could add, subtract, multiply, divide, and do square roots was created in the early 1960s. It was about a quarter of the size of a typical man's briefcase and cost on the order of $1,069. But with the advances in reliability and miniaturization of electronics that were forced to be developed during the Herculean undertaking of putting a man on the moon, combined with the ability to apply economies of scale leveraged by mass production, by the early 1980s, you could buy a calculator that did everything that 1960s desktop calculator did, and more, but was the size of a credit card and sold for $4.99. Okay, turning that same light to the audio industry, just look at what ELAC America, under the direction of their new Vice President of Engineering, Andrew Jones, is offering today. First, there is the remarkably affordable and ridiculously fantastic sounding Alchemy line of electronics, which electronics engineer Peter Magnet could have only developed and built after he spent years designing the world-class flagship Constellation electronics lines. And the same can be said of what Andrew Jones has accomplished with their debut Unify and Carina line of loudspeakers, after pioneering the UniQ driver and coupled cavity technologies at KEF in the 1980s. And while I'm sure you can find the occasional well-off audiophile who may be more concerned about having the correct products on display in his room than the actual resultant performance, I can assure you that is not typical. While some may choose to buy brand X speakers, brand Y electronics, or brand Z cables because these brands are well regarded, regularly receive good reviews, and they are the trendy products to own, the discriminating listeners, people like myself who want to disappear into the recorded event, will choose to own products that, regardless of the branding, make musical magic. And guys, believe me, nobody just wants to spend more money. Even the wealthiest of listeners won't shell out big dough if the result isn't notably engaging and more undeniably musical, period. But what I'm talking about is the utter and inexplicable suspension of disbelief that can occur when all the conditions are just right. When that perfect storm of source, electronics, speakers, cabling, software, and room setup all align. Those most miraculous of times, when, as a listener, you are permitted to completely forget that what you're listening to is a recreation, a reconstructed sonic event. When you are completely transfixed by this entirely fabricated deception, that you become unaware that the time and space of the musical event unfolding before you is merely an auditory illusion generated by a complex reconstruction engine, a conglomeration of electromechanical devices. It can be a transforming occurrence, and one that I dare say is virtually impossible to give up and walk away from. Once you have a chance to experience that kind of magic on a regular day-to-day basis, it becomes exceedingly difficult to settle for less. But I can assure you that you don't get that level of wonder and marvel from a $6,000 rig, no matter how exceptionally well balanced and enjoyable it may be. Finally, just because I'm always going on about the superrealism that hypergear can more readily reconstruct does not in any way imply that I have any issues whatsoever with more affordably priced gear, or by extension, that I look down upon or in any way project any negative judgments toward more affordable gear. I experience no need to make any judgment of your system, whatever that choice of gear was based on, whether it was based on brand, availability, your available disposable income, the credit limit on the card you used to buy your system, or because it was the gear you bought while you were in college, while you were in the service, or was handed down to you from a music-loving parent, grandparent, whatever. In fact, just the opposite is true. When something overachieves at any given price point, I'm one of the first cheerleaders out on the field to shout its praise. And I can add that routinely spending time with absolute best gear like the stuff behind me, it makes it a snap to identify overachieving gear whenever it comes along at any price. On a closing note, I'd like to tell you that the Audio Analyst website has seen a complete redesign over the past 2 weeks. There is a ton of information there, including links to every review, tweak, or show report I've had published on the web over the past 30 years. And there are even links to PDFs of some of my print articles as well. I've added the link down below for you to find it. I hope you take the time to check it out and leave your thoughts, suggestions, or feedback in the comment section below this video. Guys, I do read them and try to respond to all of them. Finally, please be sure to like, share, and subscribe if you're enjoying our conversations here. And thank you so much for dropping by today. Guys, please stay safe and keep the music playing. Till next time, cheers.